Okay, good evening, church.
Good evening, Pastor.
Welcome to Genesis Bible Study. We are going to be looking at the long story of Jacob. Jacob probably takes up more narrative than anybody else, probably more than Abraham. Jacob goes through a whole transition of being a snot-nosed young man to being a snot-nosed old man. He does evolve as time goes on. And we also see something that we might call karma happen with him, right? What is karma? What's the idea of karma? What goes around, what? Yeah, so we get some of that, and there's some other interesting things here in Jacob. This is going to be more of a Bible study than the other ones have been, because there's so much text to deal with. So we'll read a lot of that, and then we'll go away and just tell the story a little bit. When I think the story we'll do that. But so often we just tell the story and we don't read the text, and that can be really dangerous as well. Well, I have really enjoyed doing this, and I've heard from a number of you that you've enjoyed having these Bible studies as well, and watching them online and catching up that way. And I've loved all the questions that have been lobbed at me and hurled at me in some stances. None of those were from Christ the King people, but I've really enjoyed the dialogue and conversation based on this. And the question that has come up a lot recently that people have sort of been chipping at and not quite ready to say, but some people have started saying it. Pastor Daniel, are you saying that the book of Genesis is not a literal history? People have been sort of chipping away. I think we're afraid to ask this question sometimes. As softly as I can say, no. The book of Genesis is not meant to be a literal history. It is a pre-history. Let's say that the history of the Hebrew people starts when they are in slavery. Their story, their family lineage, as far back as they can remember. Think about your oldest relative. Their oldest relative was a slave in Egypt. Now, somebody asked the question, well, what happened before we were slaves in Egypt? And we use all of these narratives and myths and tales and legends to imagine what life was like before that. And because of that, we get beautiful and interesting theologies about who God is. But these stories were never meant to be historical. And I'm actually posting this video to Facebook as we speak. I made a video in my office right before I came out. To read these stories historical is actually to miss the point very often. In Genesis chapter 1, we have this great poem, right? And God does this, and it was evening and morning, and it was good. And one of the days it says God took the waters below and the waters above, and He separated the waters so that there's some waters above and some waters below. And the waters that were above became a dome that we called the sky. Now imagine that you're an ancient person and you're writing a poem about what creation is, and you've never been to outer space. You know nothing about how the earth cooled 4.5 billion years ago. You've never heard of the Big Bang 14 billion years ago. You have no concept of Milky Way or galaxy or universe or multiverse. You've heard none of that. There's been no Neil deGrasse Tyson in your life whatsoever. And you're imagining what creation looks like. And you look down and you see water, and it is what color? Blue. And you look up and you see the sky, and it is what color? Blue. And every now and then that blue sky gets covered up with something kind of white and kind of gray, and then it feels like rain, water comes down on you. Aren't you going to look up at that sky that no one's ever been to and say, there's water up there? Say yes? Yes. Yeah, that's a natural way to tell the story. Nobody has ever been into the sky. It sure looks like an ocean to me. And gosh darn it, every now and then I get wet because of it. Of course that's a way that we would tell our narrative. You see how trying to make that literal misses the point? You see how trying to make that historical, or making 6 days stretch into 6,000 years or whatever that thing that's being passed around right now is that the way that they told the stories of themselves were in relationship to God. And we could learn something from that. We are so skittish about trying to be historically accurate sometimes that we're afraid to tell any narratives. Right? It is narratives. If you ask me who I am, I'm going to answer back to you using narratives from my own life. Right? Not just science, not just statistics or facts. Right? I wouldn't just say, "Oh, hi, I'm Daniel Pugh. I'm 5'10", 175 pounds." Right? That's a weird way to introduce yourself to people, don't you think? Right? "Oh, Mom and Dad, I met the love of my life." "Oh, really? Tell me about her." "Oh, well, she's got brown hair and, she's, got eyes that are further apart than mine." And it's like a weird way to describe people completely scientifically, right? So there's more to life than just facts, right? Actually, the best parts of life have very little to do with facts. Sometimes love cannot be quantified, and there are reasons why science and religion were often partners in the dance of finding knowledge. Because facts and dry figures and understanding and pure reason and things that we don't believe until we can prove have a really important place in our lives. But loving and belonging to the mystery that we cannot comprehend or name or know also belongs in the conversation. There's another story that shows up in Genesis that's actually the end of the story that we would tell today, where Jacob has 12 sons. And they have names like Gad and Asher and Reuben and stuff like this. These were not supposed to be just a story about kids. What are those 12 names? They're the 12 tribes of Israel. So, to read that literally, like a literal man had literal sons, is to miss the point. Because the point of saying that is, look, there may be 12 tribes here in Israel. We may have differences. We may come from different families. But I'm going to tell you a story. We used to all belong to one family. And we need to unite and band together under the one God. And we need to do more together than we can alone. You see how to read that literally is to miss the point? Say yes. Yes. So there's so much that happens in Genesis that if we just read it as a history, we are way off track. But there's so much behind these stories and in these stories that deal with human emotion and struggle and passion and life and death and burial. And those are the stories that I feel compelled to bring to you. So, you're going to hear us talk a little bit today about the Jacob story, and I'm calling this wrestling with God, because although Jacob does physically wrestle with someone that he calls God, there's a way in which his whole life is a struggle to be blessed by God. What does it mean to be blessed? What are we going for when we're trying to be blessed? Of course, I put this up there because if you Google Jacob's Ladder, this is the first search result you get, which is an exercise machine. I have tried it. Anybody else been on this thing? It will wear you out in a hurry. So maybe it is a good representation of Jacob's Ladder. Maybe it is a good representation of what it means to wrestle with God as a workout. Because so much of our lives ought to be wrestling with God. And you find me saying so much that faith, like children, is what Jesus asks of us. Not that we have answers, but that we never stop asking the questions. And sometimes the questions are where the greatest understanding and belonging of our narrative is. So what makes a blessing? What makes us feel blessed? What makes us come to church? What makes us look up when the pastor says, "The Lord bless you and keep you"? What makes us come up to the table for communion? What makes us dip our finger in the water and make the sign of the cross on our forehead? What compels us to come forward when somebody's standing here with oil that they might bless us? What is it that we're looking for in life in blessing? That's the question of today's lecture. And really, it's the story of Jacob. Okay. This part is really important, or else I wouldn't put you through this dry academic exercise. Okay? But just look at me for a second. Then we'll look up at all the boring stuff up there. All right? There used to be one kingdom, and then after Solomon dies, it splits into two. That's really important to understand Hebrew Scripture. There used to be one kingdom, Saul, David, Solomon, and then after Solomon dies, it splits into two. Okay? So, up here you see Saul, David, and Solomon in blue. That's the Davidic dynasty. And then taking over on Solomon's throne, so literally in Jerusalem, are these people. Okay? And then at the same time as Rehoboam over here, Jeroboam goes up to the north. If you need help remembering which one is which, the northern kingdom is Israel, and the southern kingdom is Judah, and they are alphabetical. That's how I remembered it in seminary. The top one is the I, and the lower one is the J. Now, I know that sounds confusing to you because you are used to thinking of Israel as the part where Jerusalem is. But that's a much later story. Israel, as a name, is from the northern kingdom. And I'm going to tell you why all this matters. But I just want you to see. Can you see here? We've got Israel up top and we've got Judah down below. And we've got here that Solomon becomes king in about 965 BCE. And then after he dies, about 40 years later, so in the middle part of the 900s, is when we have this split. Now, the Davidic dynasty didn't last very long, did it? Not before this split. And the question here is which one of Solomon's sons should take over? Why is that an interesting question? Because David had sons. But which one of David's wives was his favorite? Bathsheba. And was Bathsheba David's first wife? No. So what's the lineage supposed to go through? The first son from the what? First wife. Now, when we put Solomon on the throne, we're only one child into the Davidic dynasty. Okay? Because Saul, the first king, we hardly ever even talk about, he's not related to David. David sits on the throne, and literally the very first son is supposed to be the oldest son, and it's not, it's the youngest. Okay? Now, in a world of patriarchy, that creates a huge problem. Because as soon as Solomon starts to do some bad things, and he does lots of bad things, what do the people say? We picked the wrong guy. Or, God is what? Angry with us. Which is the theological version of, we picked the wrong guy. Right? Okay, so Solomon is already this semi-bastard child who has taken the throne. And when Solomon dies, the younger brother is saying, hey, my dad was the youngest, and he was king, so I should be king, right? Does this sound really Game of Thrones to you? Yeah. Game of Thrones has a lot of resonance here, by the way. Okay? Then the oldest son's like, that is ridiculous. No one has ever heard of a dynasty that deals with the younger. You're weaker than I am. You're dumber than I am. You see how this goes, right? With brothers, right? Any of you have brothers and it goes like this. And somehow, amazingly, even though you've grown up and matured, you get together and you're 7 again. Does that happen to anybody? Or just me? Okay. My brother and his wife are expecting at this very moment, so we're hoping that something happens today. The due date was yesterday, and she went for the massage treatment where they do the thing with your feet, right? That's how desperate they are. Reflexology. Okay, so this lineage continues on down. If you want to get to Hebrew Scripture, this goes all the way, I would say, what is this, like 583? I'm asking you. Yeah, does that sound good? 583 or so, when the Babylonians come in and they destroy the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay? But 150 years before Jerusalem gets sacked, Samaria gets sacked up here. Okay? So for 150 years, this guy's saying, hey, northern kingdom, I told you so, 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 I told you so. All the way down, okay? They are saying, we were always right and you were always wrong. And you see how that's a retroactive way of judging things, right? When bad things happen, then we say, oh, we must have made God angry. Rather than saying, hey, something bad happened. Well, why am I telling you this? Because it finds its way into every narrative in the book of Genesis. You didn't know how much you needed to know this. But now that you know this, it makes the story come alive. So just to recap, Israel is the northern kingdom. Its capital is Samaria. You ever heard of the Good Samaritan? And Jesus tells that story of the Good Samaritan not in the northern kingdom, but in the southern kingdom. And it really pisses them off. You know that story? Right? And Jesus goes in John chapter 4 and he meets a woman by the well. And she says, how can you, a Jew, ask a question of me, a woman of Samaria? Okay? So that conflict has been going on for 500 years by the time we get to Jesus' day. These people have really learned to not like each other very well. Now, most of the stories that are in Genesis come from the northern kingdom. Most of the stories that you encounter in Genesis come from the northern kingdom. And we think that we know that because in almost every one of them, it is the younger child who gets blessed and not the older one. Remember in Genesis chapter 4, we talked a little bit about Cain and Abel, and it seemed like for no reason at all that that Abel was favored over Cain, right? Even though in the beginning, Cain had favor with his mom, right? And Abel didn't. Okay? Then you get to this weird story of Ishmael, right? Because Sarah can't have a child, and so she sends her maid into Abraham's tent, and they have a child, Ishmael, and then immediately she hates him, right? Can you see how that's really a story of the Game of Thrones? That's really a story of how we don't like the firstborn, right? The firstborn isn't the pure, they say, right? That was literally through a mistress, or excuse the language, a whore. You see how that story is being fed here. Now, you didn't know that you were missing that, but now that you see that, it's in every one of these narratives. And of course, what happens between Esau and Jacob? Who's supposed to get the blessing? Esau. And how does Jacob get the blessing? He dresses like Esau and he tricks his dad into giving him his older brother's blessing. You see how that's a northern story about how the second-born is more prominent than the first. And then Jacob gets his comeuppance. Everything goes around and comes around with him. But then he marries who? Leah. Does he want to marry Leah? No. But does Leah have children? Not at first. At first, he goes with Leah's maid, and then she gets jealous of the maid. Then he goes with Leah, but she doesn't have children. Then he has a child with the maid. I could be getting this confused between Leah and Rachel. Then when Rachel comes along, he marries Rachel. She's barren. I think that's right. And he goes to Rachel, and Rachel says, here, have my maid. And then he has children with Rachel's maid, and then Rachel's like, wait, I thought that was going to make me happy, but guess what? It didn't. And then Rachel has one child, and he's the youngest of 12. And who gets the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? Joseph does, the youngest. So those Joseph stories are really impactful. They show up here in really hilarious ways. Okay, so that's where we're going. I'm going to do a little bit of this reading because I'm going to skip around a little bit because otherwise we'd be very reading heavy today. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40-year-old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted him his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. The child struggled together within her. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is to be this way, why do I live?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb." Now you hear the Game of Thrones in there? Yeah? "And the 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve her brother." Now, the northern kingdom of Israel was actually probably more prosperous than the younger. For many of those years, they were saying, "See, I told you so." And then they got sacked from the Assyrians, only because the Assyrians are coming from the north, and that's who they get to first. And by the time King Sennacherib of Assyria gets down to Jerusalem, Jerusalem's well fortified, and the king gets tired, and King Sennacherib goes home. So after he goes home, then Israel says, "See, God loved us better because we survived, and you, northern kingdom, didn't." When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle. So they named him Esau. Afterward, his brother came out, with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so we named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore him. All right, so what did we get here out of this story? Are they already fighting? Yeah. She is wondering why she's alive because there's so much angst going on inside of her. There are 2 nations fighting each other in her womb. That sounds exhausting, don't you think? Yeah. Somebody needs to give her some reflexology. And as he's coming out, as Esau's being born first, Jacob reaches his hand out. Now, does this sound like a literal story? Please say no. No, not true. Cannot happen. He reaches out and he grabs the ankle of his brother. Okay? Remember what we said about that snake in Genesis chapter 3? From now on, you will slide on your belly and you will strike his heel and he will strike your head. Right? Okay? So we've got that imagery of angst, of violence, of being in opposition to each other right from the very beginning. This story, by the way, repeats, and I really wanted to get to the story of Judah and Tamar. And I haven't figured out how to work it in, but I think it's really interesting. Maybe I'll do that at the top next time and talk quickly, or we'll just go long or something. Because it's a really great story. So, and in the Tamar story, the same story repeats with her 2 children who fight on the way out of the womb. Have you heard that story before? No. All right. So, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, living in tents of game. But Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, what did you see there? Okay, who are split? Not just the children, but the parents. And what is it that the father likes? That boy can hunt. Yeah. He can feed my belly. Yeah. He's already 60, right? He's like, hey, that kid, he can go out and he can hunt. We might even say, if we were going to do a gender analysis of this, he's a man's man. Esau. He's hairy. He can hunt. He spends time not in the tent, but out there. He's away. Like a man. He smells like a man. That actually comes up in this thing too. He says, "Oh, you smell like my son Esau." Okay? Yeah, so that's things going on. And then what do we say about Jacob? Is he a man's man? No. He's kind of an indoor kid.
He likes to stay home with mom.
He likes to stay home in the tents with his mom. All right. Now, this is a really interesting story, I think. And you see how trying to read it literally is to miss the beauty of the story. This story is your story and my story. This is a story of favoritism of parents. This is a story of people getting blessings that they don't deserve. This is a story of how we want our children to be in our image rather than be their own person. Right? A little bit of that going on here too. Okay. I told you this already. But what I didn't tell you is that in each one of these stories, eventually, the younger child is always favored by the mother. Now, it is true that with Cain and Abel, that Eve preferred Cain, but by the time Seth is born, she's kind of really annoyed that Cain killed his brother, right? And Seth becomes her favorite. Now, what does this tell you about the text? What do you see here when you see that the mother favors the younger child? Nothing?
The mother doesn't buy into the whole patriarchy thing.
Okay. The mother doesn't buy into the whole patriarchy thing, Susan said. Exactly. And who was the woman who started this in the Game of Thrones? Bathsheba. Bathsheba favored her son, and she convinced David to let Solomon sit on the throne. And that's what started the whole thing. And Solomon, it feels like in the text, was also fighting this gender normative behavior of men are really strong, right? Solomon was said to be wise. He was said to be scholarly. He was said to be more of the indoor kid than the outdoor kid, all right? So we're seeing that story manifest itself. And we could talk at length about whether or not these gender normative ideals are good, but let's at least agree that they are problematic. When we expect all boys to be hunters, and half of the boys come out and they don't want to be hunters, that's our problem, not theirs. That is our problem for putting expectations on them. Okay. Esau sells his birthright. This is another common narrative that has to do with that Game of Thrones idea. Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of the red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore he was called Edom, which means red stuff. Jacob said, "First, sell me your birthright." Esau says, "I am about to die. Of what use is my birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank, and rose and went away. Then Esau despised his birthright. What story are you seeing here? How do you see this story? Is Esau a bit impulsive? And is Jacob the one who planned ahead? Okay. Think back to Cain and Abel. Do you remember that God favored Abel's offering? Because he was the farmer. And being a farmer means that you planned ahead. Being a farmer means that there's always food if you plan it right. But his brother Cain made a burnt offering, right? And God did not like the smell of it. Because being a hunter was a less stable form of sustenance. You had to be nomadic and follow the herd. And we hear from God right after Eve becomes pregnant. God has a sit down with Adam and says, "You need to become a farmer. You need to stop chasing women and animals." Right? You need to become somebody who settles down and becomes a farmer. There's a favoritism for that. Right? So Samaria is actually a bigger city than Jerusalem, than the north. It's a more prosperous city, which means that it's been around longer, it's more established, it has better relations with other places, and it has probably more technologically advanced farming. All right. So the northern kingdom would have this story as well. Okay, so he sells his birthright for a pot of stew. Good deal, bad deal? It's a pretty bad deal. Pretty bad deal. This is what we call a trickster narrative. This is the same sort of trickster narrative that showed up in the Garden of Eden. Do you feel a similarity in the writing style of the Garden of Eden story in this one? There's detail, there's humor, there's surprise endings. Yeah. So these are all the J source, the Yahweh source. This is all the story of God who comes down close to us. Okay. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. And they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. Okay, now Isaac liked his boy, who was a man's man, right? He liked him. But then the thing that God told Abraham not to do, don't marry these foreigners in the land. Don't intermarry with them. He does. He does. He does the thing that Abraham was told not to do. Okay? And in that, this is right after he loses his blessing. So there's a link between losing your birthright, right? There's a subliminal message that you will lose your birthright if you marry the Hittites into the land, right? And Isaac is now annoyed. What's the word? Made bitter. It made life bitter for Isaac, even with his chosen son. Okay, I feel like I'm boring you. Okay, Isaac blesses Jacob. We know this story a little bit. Rebekah is listening to Isaac and Esau, and Isaac says, I want you to go out and kill something for me, boy, and bring that in here and cook it up for me, and I'm going to give you my blessing. And Rebekah heard this, and then she goes to Jacob, her indoor kid, and says, hey, I've already got the animal, okay? All I need you is to dress up in the sheep's clothing, put the sheep's wool on, right? And go in there and pretend to be your brother. Now, the narrative here becomes really interesting because Isaac is really not quite believing, right? He's really skeptical of this new Esau. Isn't that interesting here in the story? I heard your... look, my brother's a hairy man, and I am a man of smooth skin. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse on myself and not a blessing. So the stakes are high, right? You definitely don't want a blessing. And his mother throws herself in front of her son and says, let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my word and go get them for me. So he went and got them and brought them. Then Rebekah took the best garments of his brother, and he put on them. Then she handed the savory food and bread that she prepared to her son Jacob. So he went to his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am. Who are you, my son? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you've told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, so that you may bless me. But Isaac said to his son, how is it that you found it so quickly, my son? It's a really funny narrative, don't you think? He answered, because the Lord your God granted me success. Then Isaac said to Jacob, come near that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not. So Jacob went up to his father Isaac, who felt him and said, the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Okay, so now Isaac is being played the fool also, right? For choosing wrong, for choosing the wrong son, we're now making fun of one of our most famous patriarchs, Isaac. That's a really interesting and deep and complex narrative, because Isaac was the golden child, right? And now he's being played the fool. Sort of a little bit of nothing lasts forever, and that we're all humbled in God's eyes. That's certainly a theme that shows up in Genesis. And he said, the smell of my son is like the smell of the field that the Lord has blessed. It tells to me like he smells like dung. I don't know if that's how you read that, but I'm not sure if he's out there hunting and that's the smell his dad likes. I don't know what that smell is. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who cursed you, and bless everyone who blesses you. All right, so we know this picture here. Sorry, I didn't get rid of those. But we know this picture here, right? He's made his hands look like that, and his dad's been played the fool a little bit. Then Esau comes back in, and he says, what happened? And Isaac stands by his blessing to Jacob. Even though he doesn't want to, he feels as if his word is a covenant. He feels as if his word has bonded him in some way to God's command for him. That I find to be a really interesting theology. In a world that is hanging in the balance of civilization and chaos, a man's word is the strongest, most important thing that we can lift up. Isn't it still? She asks. I think so. Until we get lawyers involved. And then whatever we signed, even though we didn't pay attention to what we were signing at the time, what we sign now becomes the law of the land, even though we don't really know what it says, and our words have become less meaningful than what we sign, even though our words seem to be from us. So that we live in an odd time on the front of what truth is, which also leads to the question of what exactly is blessing. What is it that those words do to us? What do we get from them? Okay, so since we're not just going to read the text all the way through, I thought we'd just skip over this by telling you what happens. Jacob runs away to Laban, who is his mother's brother. So he runs to his uncle, but not on his dad's side, on his mother's side. And while there, he casts his eyes on a beautiful woman named named Rachel. And on the way there, he has this experience of stairway to heaven, right? Of Jacob's ladder, which is not just an exercise routine, but it's also this idea that the place is hallowed, and that there he builds an altar, and that altar also comes with a well, and that well survives all the way until Jesus' day. That well is in the north, right? So, what's that?
Is it the well where the Samaritan?
It's the well that the Samaritan woman is at. And the story of John chapter 4 leans very heavily on the meeting of Jacob and Rachel. Yeah. Just wait till we teach John. John has blown my mind more than anything in the entire world. I studied theater in college, and John is of a level written above Shakespeare, 10 degrees in my opinion. So we're gonna do that. It's a couple of years. We'll string that one out. We'll dangle that one for a little bit. By the way, next semester, I've decided that I'd like to do some other things and not teach this Bible study, but Pastor Wolfgang is going to teach this Bible study. Pastor Wolfgang would like to teach you all on the book of Acts and about how to make disciples in the early church. And since we are not an early church, but we do feel, it does feel like we're on the ground floor of something. And who better than Pastor Wolfgang to bring that to all of us? So I'm excited about that, and I hope that you are as well. So I think my rhythm will be that I'll teach every fall. It takes a lot of time. It basically takes me all of Thursday to prepare for Thursday night. And there's some other things I'd like to try my hand at. So that's going to be really exciting. Okay, so this thing happens with Jacob, And then Jacob meets Rachel, and as we've been talking about biblical marriage, some people brought this up as a really happy one. Of course, she's also married to her sister first. That's a weird thing. But this is a beautiful line. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Say, aw. I know, that's a sweet story. But at the end of 7 years, guess what? Now, I'm just bringing this up because if you read the text, there is no wedding. Okay? I was surprised to find that when I looked it up. Because I always imagined that there was a wedding, and I'm sure that I've said more than once that at the wedding, right, the bride gets switched. There is no wedding. Here's the line. But in the evening, he, meaning Laban, the dad, took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. That is biblical marriage. At no point is she given a voice, right? We think that Rachel has a voice. We'd like to believe that since Jacob wants to marry her, that she wants to marry him. He did kiss her by that well all those years ago. But here there lacks the romance and the mystery and the joy of a wedding, and has much more to do with going into her in a place so dark that he can't tell that it's actually Leah and not Rachel. I'm just... What's that?
Wasn't he drunk?
Yeah, that's not in the text, but I think we can infer, that they...
Later he got drunk.
It said they had a big feast. And then the next... You know what the next line is? The next line is, and then he woke up in the morning and gasp, it was Leah! Right? That he had been foiled the whole time. I just want to see the next scene where he has to go tell Rachel, I thought it was you the whole time, right? Yeah, right, right. Poor Rachel. I mean, you could feel bad for Jacob because he worked all these years, but Rachel has to wait another 7 years, and she doesn't get to be married for the next 7 years like Jacob does. But isn't it interesting that we have this sort of iconography of a wedding? There is absolutely no wedding in the text. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. He worked another 7 years. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob. Sorry, this is the first 7. And when morning came, it was Leah. That is the whole wedding scene there. Okay, Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. So Jacob went into Rachel also. Okay, so sorry, where did we get there? Complete this week, and then I'll give you her after another 7 years. Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife and gave the maid to Rachel. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. He served Laban for another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Leah conceived and bore a son, and she named him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon me with affliction, surely now my husband will love me. Have you read this story in a while? It's really sad. She has a child, and she says, maybe now he'll love me. And then she has another child, and she says, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, I have given this son also. And again she conceived. Now this time my husband will be joined to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. But he loved somebody else the whole time. This is biblical marriage. This is what the stories actually say is happening. Therefore she named him Judah. Then she ceased bearing. Judah means to praise the Lord. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. Now, who does her sister envy? Her. And she said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Jacob became very angry with Rachel. That's a little bit of trouble in paradise. and said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of your womb? He's passing the buck on to God, right? There's a little bit of the Garden of Eden story there, I think. Yeah. Then she said, here is my maid Bilhah, go into her, that she may bear upon my knees, and that I too may have children through her. So she gave her her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged me, and he also heard my voice and gave me a son. Therefore she named him Dan. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. So she named him Naphtali. Then she finally gets her son. Okay, so these 3 chapters here, after Rachel finally gets her son and names him Joseph. I left that part out because that's the last Bible study we're going to do. In December is going to be on that, and it's going to be great. Jacob runs away with his wife, and so Laban, who is Rachel and Leah's dad, has watched Jacob become really rich, and Laban has become really poor. And Laban's sons are saying, I think we need to kill this guy, Jacob. So Jacob runs away with his 2 sons, and Laban catches up to him, right? Because he took all the goats, right? And of course that's going to make Laban mad. There's this scene where Rachel has taken the figures of the gods and she's hid them under herself, and then he comes in and doesn't find them. Laban doesn't find them. Jacob and Laban resolve. And Jacob, who's now a little more advanced in age, now he's obtained a little bit more. He realizes that it's the right thing to do to make up with his brother Esau. So he puts together a peace offering for him. Right after he sends that peace offering, but before he's received word, Jacob wrestles with God. But during the night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He got them safely across the brook with all his possessions, but Jacob stayed behind by himself. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he couldn't get the best of Jacob as they wrestled, he deliberately threw Jacob's hip out of joint. The man said, let me go. It is daybreak. And Jacob said, I'm not letting you go till you bless me. The man said, what is your name? And he answered, Jacob. The man said, but no longer. Your name is no longer Jacob. From now on, it's Israel, which means God wrestler. You've wrestled with God and you've come through. Jacob said, what is your name? The man said, why do you want to know my name? And then, right then and there, he blessed him. Jacob named the place Peniel, God's face, because he said, I saw God face to face and lived to tell the story. The sun came up as he left Peniel, limping because of his hip. That's why Israelites don't eat the hip muscle, because Jacob's hip was thrown out of joint. This one, by the way, is the Message, this last one here. But I liked how it told this story. What does this story tell you about the theology of God? What's going on here? Jacob's wrestling with God. In a really interesting figurative sense. He's been wrestling with God his whole life. He wanted to get blessing with his dad and he couldn't. He was the indoor kid and not the outdoor kid. And then he tries to make his mom happy. It was his mom's idea that he dress up and pretend to be Esau and get his father's blessing. But when he goes and he does that, then he upsets his older brother. And so he runs away. He runs where his mom tells him to. He runs to his uncle and he tells his uncle, I was supposed to get my blessing back home. I did what my mom told me to do and it still didn't work. But I love your daughter. Can I marry her? And he says, yes. And then he lies to Jacob. And then Jacob marries Leah and he's having all of these children with the woman he doesn't love while working another 7 years to marry the woman that he does love, only to find out that she is barren. And when she asks Jacob to give her a son, it becomes very clear that she's the one who can't have children, not Jacob. Jacob seems to be having a child every time he has an opportunity to. But the woman he loves is barren. And right after Joseph is born, right after he becomes prosperous, this scene happens where he realizes that the right thing for him to do is to reconcile with his brother. And right after he sends away the reconciliation, right after he makes peace with his brother, he wrestles with God. The culmination of years of angst, of not feeling welcome, of not belonging anywhere, of not receiving a single blessing. Not a blessing from his dad, unless he lied. Not a blessing from his uncle, because his uncle lied to him. Not a blessing from God because he had never had a child with the woman he loved. Jacob tries to make peace with his brother. He tries to reconcile, to bring forgiveness, to bring right relationship, to bring unity in God's house and in God's family. And right after he does that, he says to God, I will not let you go until you bless me. There's something really powerful about forgiveness. There's something really powerful when you have been holding on, when you've been harboring anger and resentment, or you've done someone else wrong and you're harboring anxiety and pain and blame and feeling worthless, and you finally realize that you should make that right. When you realize that you, for your part, can try to mend the situation, and when you forgive someone else, you set someone free, and then you realize the person you've set free is you. And when you ask for forgiveness, even if it's not accepted, you set someone free and you realize the person who's been set free is you. You cannot control your environment. You cannot control how your parents act. You cannot control how your children act. You cannot control if anyone forgives you or blesses you. You cannot trust a man when he tells you that you can marry the woman of your dreams. You cannot be guaranteed that life will go according to plan. But you can wrestle with God, and you can hold God so tightly that you say, I will not let go until you find a way to bless me. Because I want to be reconciled with the God who created me. I want to be redeemed by the God who loves me. There's something beautiful and profound and mysterious about blessing that cannot be found in the question of, is this story historically accurate? The mystery of a true blessing is to not let go of God. The mystery of the blessing is to remember that you are a child of God, as we all are, and that being created in the image of God means that we deserve something better. I had this kid in confirmation a few years ago who was being bullied at school. And he and I sat down one day because his mom had told me that he had withdrawn and that he didn't want to be part of the family anymore. He didn't want to be with his friends anymore. And we sat down and I said, I think you're going through a really tough time. Why don't you tell me some more about it? And he said, well, there's this guy at school and he just picks on me and he calls me all these names and he laughs at me and he hates me and he beats me up and I'm so tired of being that. And we talked about ways that we could report bullying without, being a tattletale. We talked about how we could get away with all of that. But the underlying message had nothing to do with the pain, the physical pain and embarrassment of being bullied. The biggest problem that this kid had was that he was starting to believe it. He's starting to believe the words of the bully. He's starting to believe that he was a bunch of terrible nicknames, that he was intrinsically worse off, that he was less blessed, that he was not physically as gifted, that he wasn't the version of maleness that he was supposed to be, that he wasn't the strong, that he was always going to be weak, and that this being picked on was going to last his entire life. So that boy and I walked into the sanctuary. We walked up to the baptismal font. I said, "You were baptized in this very church, right here at this very font. And in your baptism, you were named." We said your 3 names, and then we said God's 3 names. And those are the only names that get to define who you are. And don't let anybody else call you anything else. And don't let any of that stick. Because you are a blessed child of God. You have been sealed by the Holy Spirit and marked with the cross of Christ forever. And we pastors can sometimes get really heady and theological about what exactly baptism means or what exactly blessing means. But I hope that just like Jacob, in the toughest moments of our lives, we say, "I will not let go until you bless me and remind me of who I am and whose I am." Well, that turned into a little bit more of a sermon than a Bible study, but that's all we have for the night. Can we get an amen? Amen. So, sisters and brothers in Christ, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord look upon you with favor and give you his peace. Amen. That's all we have for tonight. We're going to take a couple weeks off, and I will see you after Thanksgiving. Thanks for coming. Good night.